road trips to Vermont and New Hampshire. Um, yeah, basically, yeah, those two states yeah, they're mostly, hills, hills and mountains. Yeah, it's like, they're, like I said, they're about, yeah, and they're mostly filled with small towns and villages and, um, unlike Massachusetts, where you have it's more populated. The southern part of New England, the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are more densely populated, so you find larger towns, larger cities. They also tend to be somewhat, flatter. Of course, they're more closer to the coast. Um, but yeah, Vermont and New Hampshire are more rural, more country. And lots of beautiful little towns, very historic towns, old towns. Well, throughout New England, but almost all the cities and towns there are quite old. So it's like the oldest settled part of the United States, or at least from a Western perspective, when the Europeans, the English, came to settle. Um, so yeah, a lot of history there, a lot of American history there that so many important things or institutions that were started in that region of the country. So that's yeah, it was very nice, very beautiful to explore that region, and yeah, just to give you a little bit of context in terms of Vermont and New Hampshire. Vermont is like between New York and New Hampshire, and Vermont, um, the it tends to the hills there. It's more the hills there are not quite as tall as the ones in New Hampshire. Yeah, there's hills and low mountains in Vermont, and then when you go just to the east, crossing the the Connecticut River forms the boundary between both states. But they're both small states geographically speaking, right next to each other. But when you cross into New Hampshire, yeah, the mountains tend to get more taller. Like there's taller hills and taller mountains. So New Hampshire, um, for instance, you have a chain of mountains or a section of mountains in Vermont referred to as the Green Mountains, but they're sort of like sort of smaller mountains. And then when you over in New Hampshire, you have a chain or a region of mountains called the White Mountains in New Hampshire, and they're more in the kind of in the central and northern part of New Hampshire. And yeah, the mountains in New Hampshire are the tallest mountains in the northeastern part of the United States. That's where you find the tallest mountains, the more in the northeastern part of the United States. And they're kind of, comparable. The mountains you find in New Hampshire are comparable in height to the ones that you find, let's say, in down in or in North Carolina or Eastern Tennessee or Western North Carolina. Kind of similar in height. Um, yeah. So also, when you go west of Vermont into New York State, or what what people from downstate, where I'm originally from, New York City, what we refer to as upstate New York, the northern part of New York State, north of New York City. When you go farther north, like going towards Canada, you'll find the Adirondack Mountains, and there's a section of those mountains that are actually also pretty tall as well, like almost comparable to what you find in New Hampshire. So those are taller mountains as well. Those are some of the tallest peaks in the Northeast as well. So basically, New Hampshire and upstate New York, specifically in the Adirondack Mountains. Then you have some other mountains that are closer to New York City, further south, the Catskill Mountains. But those mountains are like lower in height, more like tall hills or smaller mountains. But yeah, the Adirondacks are more prominent, more higher peaks, and that's also a very beautiful area. And but yeah, I remember, yeah, I just when I went to that region of New Hampshire, I just was um, I wanted to I was taking pictures with my cheap 35 millimeter film camera back then. So so the photos actually some of the photos came out slightly darker than what it really was at the time in terms of the sunlight. But anyway, you get the idea when you look at the photos. Um, yeah, and there's also a lot of beautiful like lakes, especially in New Hampshire, some large lakes, in and around the hills and the mountains. So yeah, it's very picturesque, very, very nice. And again, and when you go there, you go to a lot of the little towns, and you find a lot of very old, not just, of course, very old houses and architecture, including a lot of very old churches with tall steeples. Um, yeah, you can see a few of those or a couple of those in one of my photos. Um, yeah, yeah, the towns there have their own kind of specific sort of layout that's kind of unique to New England in the way they laid out their little towns and villages. And there's also when I was driving to New Hampshire, there's an area there. There's Within the White Mountains, you have actually the tallest peak, the tallest mountain in the northeastern part of the United States. It's called Mount Washington, and you can see it in a couple of my photos. You can see there's a there's actually you can go to the top of the mountain in different ways if you want. You can go to the peak. Um, One way to go there, and I believe it's actually in terms of I believe the to the top of the summit is something like 6,288 feet. Which is pretty high, by the standards of the eastern part of the United States. I mean, I know that's not as tall as the mountains that you find in the western part of the United States, but in the eastern part, that's pretty tall. And so anyway, one way to get to the top of the mountain of Mount Washington um, is you can take like a shuttle van or a small shuttle, yeah, like a van that will you can be driven up there. There's like a long winding road that goes up to the top of Mount Washington. It's about 6 or 7 miles, to get to the top from the base. Um, and then another way is you can take a railroad, like a train. There's like a train that will take you up there, apparently. But then you're also allowed to drive up there by yourself, or you can drive up there in your own vehicle, your own car, or whatever, pickup, SUV, whatever, minivan, whatever you have. Um, Not, there are days when the weather conditions are just too rough, and of course the road will be closed, and nobody will be allowed to go to the summit of Mount Washington. So anyway, on that particular day that I went to New Hampshire, yeah, I drove, by the mountain, sort of at the base on the road that's at the base of the mountain, where you can see the mountain in the distance, and you can see the entrance road of the road that goes up to the top of the mountain, that eventually reaches the top of the mountain after about a 6 or 7 mile distance. It's kind of like yeah, they designed it in such a way that, I mean, it's kind of steep, but it's gradual enough, or that's why they had to make it 6 or 7 miles long so you can eventually reach the top, so you can drive there and back, and you can drive there and then drive back down. um but I was thinking about doing that. I was thinking about driving by the time I got there, but by the time I got there, it was kind of later in the afternoon, and I knew that um yeah, it was going to get it was going to start to it was going to start to get dark pretty soon, or relatively. But I knew that by the time I made it up there and then got down, there wasn't going to be enough time. I got there later in the day. By the time I made it up there or to that specific area. So no, I didn't actually drive. up the road. It's called the Mount Washington Auto Road. But basically, I was fine with that. I just took pictures from the base, from one of the road that bypasses that area of the White Mountains. It's called the Presidential Range. There's like those are some of the tallest peaks in in the state of New Hampshire and in the Northeast. There's Mount Washington. Another one is called Mount Jefferson. Another one is called Mount Adams, and they're all in that sort of close proximity to each other. Of course, there's many other mountains there as well with all sorts of other names, but in that specific spot, they call them the presidential range. And so yeah, yeah, that was basically, yeah. New Hampshire has the taller mountains, the tallest mountains in New England in that region, and then if you go east into there, you east of New Hampshire, you find the state of Maine, which also where mountain you also find mountains there as well. The Appalachian Mountains continue, but again, they're not quite as high as in New Hampshire. Um, but Maine is also a very beautiful state. You find all sorts of yeah, you find hills and mountains there as well, and lakes, and then of course Maine has a very long and intricate coastline. But yeah, I drove along the coast of Maine and went to Portland, which is the largest city in Maine, but it's a small city, by most standards. But it's a very, old historic city as well, and very interesting and uh, picturesque in many spots. The coast up there, it's like they have a lot of rocks. It's a rocky coastline. There's not like a lot of like sand beaches. It's like, but it's an interesting, very beautiful, picturesque sort of a coastline that goes in and out and has different islands uh, up and down the coast, and even some hills or overlooks and small cliffs in certain areas, or just areas of just like rocks and rocky coastline. And and then you have some famous, you have the famous lighthouse in Portland, Maine, and anyway, Maine is also a very beautiful state. Also, it's a mostly rural state, um, compared to the southern New England, compared to Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut, which are, Rhode Island and Connecticut are very small states, but they're, more densely populated.